want you to do an exercise. I want you to think far back to the first RPG you've ever played and what system you played the game on. And I want you to leave a comment on what that game was and whether it was on a console or a computer. I'm going to guess that if your game was a JRPG, you played it on a console. But if it was a Western RPG, you played the game on a computer. The reason for that being that before 2006, Western RPGs were almost always exclusive to computers. And before 2010, JRPGs were almost always exclusive to consoles. But have you ever wondered why that is? It may be hard to believe now, considering you can easily play games like The Witcher, Fallout, Dragon Age, or Skyrim on the PS4, Xbox One, or Nintendo Switch. Or the fact that I could go to Steam right now and play through dozens of JRPGs from popular series like Final Fantasy, Tales of, Hyperdimension Neptunia, The Legend of Heroes, and many more. And perhaps even more difficult to believe is the fact that if you ever find yourself playing a JRPG on your computer, you owe it all to Recettear. A game about a small girl and her fairy running an item shop for adventurers. It may be difficult to remember now, but there was a time when Western RPGs and JRPGs were so distant platform-wise that most console players had never even played a Western RPG, and most PC gamers only knew JRPGs through emulation. In fact, there was a time when Western RPGs were simply known as computer RPGs. Sure, some console owners might have played titles like the original Diablo on the PlayStation or Deus Ex on the PS2, but let's be honest here, those were a tiny minority. As you might expect, this sparked a ton of debate online. Go to any online gaming forums between the early to mid-2000s and the Western RPG versus JRPG debate was a common topic, usually filled with insults, non sequiturs, and memes meant to shame those who did not play the same subgenre you did.
Ah yes, good times, very good.
Even gaming journalists would sink their teeth into this discussion, with clickbait titles like 10 ways to save JRPGs. JRPGs need to evolve or die. Final Fantasy isn't dying, it's already dead, among others. But all of this just to say that these two subgenres were worlds apart, in platforms and fans. Nothing like what we have today. But in the early 2000s, this began to change. Console gamers were now slowly being introduced to Western RPGs, and this revolution was largely led by the Xbox brand. The original Xbox would launch in 2001, and even though it was a console, the hardware itself was based on PCs of the time. Thanks to that, the Xbox would be the first console to receive a healthy flow of Western RPGs with titles like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, Jade Empire, Elder Scrolls Morrowind, Arx Fatalis, Deus Ex Invisible War, and more. This would introduce a portion of console gamers to this subgenre, but as you most likely know, the Xbox only accounted for 12% of all console sales during its generation. So the floodgates weren't open or anything, but however small it was, there was indeed an opening. Jump to the following generation, however, and that's when everything changed. The Xbox 360 was launched and came out swinging. And soon, titles like The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and Fallout 3 were all praised by critics and loved by console and PC gamers alike. Not only that, but with their commercial success on the Xbox 360, soon enough, all of these games would also be brought over to the PlayStation 3. And from there on, Western RPGs became a common sight on console libraries. But the reverse was not happening for PCs. PCs in the West were quite simply not a platform where you'd play Japanese role-playing games. The Xbox 360 hardware was essentially that of a PC. But even though Microsoft's console was getting games like Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon, Infinite Undiscovery, Star Ocean 4, Eternal Sonata, or Enchanted Arms, the truth is, none of these games were being brought over to PCs. I should point out that in Japan, JRPGs were pretty common on computers, like the PC 88, PC 98, and the MSX. But these platforms are not what we think of when discussing PC gaming, not to mention that the games themselves were exclusive to Japan. JRPGs would also be launched for Windows operating systems in Japan, but they would not receive a Western launch at all. The best you could hope for was maybe a fan-made translation, which could be up to 50% complete if you were lucky. But if you were a Western PC gamer, you would be hard-pressed to find any JRPG at all. In fact, let's count every JRPG ever launched in the West for computers between 1989, the year in which Dragon Quest launched in America, and September 2010, the date in which Recettear launched on Steam. In 1989, Broderbund, the same publisher and studio behind games like Lode Runner, Karateka, Prince of Persia, Myst, and The Last Express, would bring over Ancient Land of Ys, Webarm, and Psychic War Cosmic Soldier, all of which were developed in Japan but then brought over to MS-DOS. And as far as I know, none of these were commercially successful, as their JRPG lineup for computers came to an end with just these 3 titles. The following year in 1990, Sierra Online was the next major publisher to throw their hat into the ring with Sorcerian and Zeliard. Up to this point, Sierra Online was mostly known for its point-and-click adventure titles, like King's Quest, Space Quest, Police Quest, and Quest for Glory. And both Sorcerian and Zeliard were brought over due to a trip the company's founder, Ken Williams, took to Japan. He was so impressed with the gaming scene there that he signed several publishing deals with multiple Japanese studios, and would bring over not just these 2 games, but also Japanese games from other genres like Texter and Sylphid. Unfortunately, it seems Texter was the only profitable series, as they also published its sequel, Firehawk Texter: The Second Contact, as well as the remake, Texter 95. But when it came to JRPGs, they quickly gave up after Sorcerian and Zeliard. We now jump 5 years to 1995 and Softtag, a small gaming company which converted and translated Princess Maker 2 to MS-DOS, and then tried to find a publisher for it. But as it would turn out, their publisher would end up going bankrupt, and the game never officially launched in the West. But as any PC gamer will tell you, a near-complete copy of the game was leaked the following year, and it was a massive underground hit within the PC gaming community. But sadly, the Western rights to the game were now tangled up in a confusing web of companies, and it would not be until 2016 that the game would finally receive an official Western launch through Steam. Though many fans would argue that the original MS-DOS port is still the definitive version. Oddly enough, despite this being the first case of a JRPG discovering a pretty big following with the Western PC gaming community, no one ever attempted to port or bring any of the Princess Maker sequels to either consoles or PCs in the West. We now jump to 1998 and 1999, with the PC ports of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII respectively. Both were brought over by Eidos, who would ironically end up being acquired by Square Enix in 2009. I'm not sure why they stopped at Final Fantasy VIII. Perhaps the games were not commercially successful, or maybe Sony wanted to keep the series exclusive to the PlayStation. But either way, it wouldn't be until 2014 that a non-MMO Final Fantasy would be launched on PC. From this point on, PC gamers would receive Grandia 2 in 2002, Breath of Fire 4 in 2003, and finally The Last Remnant in 2009. This means that between 1989 and 2010, the year in which Recettear was launched, PCs received a total of 10 JRPGs, which translates to 1 JRPG every 2 years. And if we take into account that half of the games from this list were launched between 1989 and 1990, it means PC gamers in the 90s and 2000s would only receive a single JRPG every 4 years. Now granted, the PC also received titles like Recettear, Silver, and Sudeki. But these were actually not developed in Japan. These are Western games that try to mimic the JRPG formula. Though once again, as far as I know, none of these were commercial successes. Especially Recettear and Silver, which were the only games to have been released by their respective developers. But why would this happen? Why would Japanese developers ignore a platform as large and established in the West as the PC? Well, I may not have a definitive answer, but I believe it's a mix of past attempts being commercially unsuccessful, especially when compared to their console counterparts, and the fact Japanese developers at the time were not comfortable with all the variety and combinations that were possible on PCs. I mean, let's not forget how the original PC port of Resident Evil 4 didn't even have mouse controls, so you were forced to play a third-person shooter using a keyboard, or how Dark Souls had several graphical and optimization issues which were fixed by modders within a week. But how does all of this relate to Recettear? Simply put, Recettear was the first time a JRPG became a critical and commercial hit on PCs. Not only that, but this was the first JRPG developed in Japan and released in the West exclusively for PCs. This meant that if you were a console gamer who wanted to play Recettear, you'd have to buy it on Steam. But considering how the game itself was anything but demanding at the time of release, it meant that even those with older computers would likely play Recettear just fine. Additionally, mainstream websites and magazines were fawning over the game. Eurogamer, for example, would score the game a 9 out of 10, calling it one of the best indie games to arrive this year. You would also see a torrent of interviews with the developers, Easy Game Station, or its publisher Carp Fulgor. But more importantly, in terms of sales, Recettear was a runaway success, surprising even the publisher itself. In fact, according to Carp Fulgor's founder, on December 2010, just 3 months after Recettear's launch, the game had outsold even their most optimistic expectations 10 times over. Simply put, Recettear was a success, a big one, especially for a PC JRPG in 2010. And as the year drew to a close, their sales numbers reveal turned everyone's heads: media, publishers, and developers. The game was topping Steam's sales charts, outselling even AAA titles. And this was it. This was the point when Japanese developers and publishers realized that there was money to be had by porting their games to PC. Try to think of any JRPG on Steam, and I assure you it was launched after Recettear took the platform by storm. And from there on, every major JRPG publisher joined the race, with Dark Souls and the Ys series being the first games to hit Steam in late 2011 and early 2012, all of which were commercially successful endeavors. In fact, most likely, these games more than surpassed Recettear's sales. But that's not the point. The point is that Recettear was the game that got the ball rolling. And in the following years, Steam would receive the rest of the Ys series, the Final Fantasy series, The Legend of Heroes, Hyperdimension Neptunia, and so much more. So the next time you're playing a JRPG on your computer, take a brief moment and contemplate that all of this was only possible because of a little girl, her fairy, and their small item shop for adventurers. Hey everyone, Thank you for watching Stika's Retro Corner. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this video. All that fun social media stuff. And you can also support me on Patreon. It may not seem like it, but even $1 is a really big help in keeping this channel going. I also want to thank my newest Patreon supporter, Matt Clements. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!